Before we had camcorders where you have a camera and a recorder in one. Here's the camera, tube, and recorder, and they go together like that to form a camcorder. Before that, the recorder was separate to the camera. This one here, NV3000 or PV3000 in some regions, would have been paired with a camera like this, which has a cable on it with a 10-pin connector that you plug into the side of the VCR, and then you put a battery in there, and you can take this out somewhere and record video onto full-size VHS tapes. Or you might have had a camera like this going with the same machine. Let's take a look inside some of these VCRs. This is a fairly old model. The next one that came out, there are a few, I don't have all of them in the range, but one of the newer ones is the NV100, and that's the same deal with a camera connector on it. And with this one you would have used some newer, slightly smaller cameras, like this one. Maybe that's not smaller. It's got autofocus, which is quite exciting, and there's a grip that you can bring down, so it's quite exciting. Or pretty much the same thing but in a smaller package. This one here, WVP55, which again has the ultrasonic autofocus and a extendable microphone. And for tripod mounting, the pistol grip goes to the side to expose the tripod thread. And that plugs into the side of the VCR. Then we've got a slightly newer one again. NV180. Really nice and slim and lightweight. Battery in there. Camera connects there. And then there's a range of even smaller cameras. WVP-A2. Fold up like that. Still a tube camera. Or but if you're fancy, there was a CCD camera available. F2. CCD camera. Probably one of the first to use CCD. Still not small for a thing that's just a video camera, but that goes nicely with the NV180 VCR. Let's have a look inside these different VCRs and see how the mechanics and electronics in them has changed over the years. Let's have a look in the NV3000 first, the older machine. We don't have to take that one apart. I have the innards from a different one right here. It has an older VHS mechanism in it with quite a lot of mechanical parts. The capstan motor is a DC motor, not a brushless type, and that's belt driven. The electronics are getting on a bit. It's starting to have issues with capacitor leaking, corroding the board. I had some of these machines that worked perfectly about 10 years ago and now won't work at all because the capacitors have gone bad, and there's so many of them all over the board it's not really worth it to replace them, and they've started damaging the tracks and the through holes because these are very early through hole plated boards. They're not actually plated through, they have something that's been put into the holes, the through holes, that is easy to damage with soldering irons. The through hole connections are got a little white bit around them, and there are warnings in the service manual about not touching them with the soldering iron and not passing too much current through them. There's also some flex stuff there. Now look at that mechanism. So there's a flat belt there to drive the capstan. and then there's a square belt coming off that to drive the reels from here, and then there's a smaller motor which does the loading with a belt to the pulley, and then this large belt which goes over here, and then that moves this gear around with various tracks in it to control the mechanism. There's some switches there for it to detect what position it's in, and there's also the mode switch there which slides along to tell the electronics what position things are in. It's a very big, heavy mechanism. Let's take the cassette loading frame off. As usual with national Panasonic brand, you undo the red screws for servicing. It's going to pop out on the spring, the JIS2 screwdriver, which fits them well. You can tell they're JIS screws because there's a small dot next to the cross shape there. Phillips won't fit perfectly in them. We might have to release this. There we go, so that comes out easily for servicing. You see there's an idler there with a tire on it to go between the feed and take up reels, and the standard M loading system. Yeah, it's all looking a bit tired and old. There's the end sensors, and this uses a light bulb rather than an LED. That was common in all of the older VHS machines. I'm not sure why they used a light bulb rather than an LED, because the LEDs did exist, but maybe the infrared LEDs weren't good enough at that point in time to work there, so light bulbs. There's a dew sensor there for detecting if there's condensation forming on the metal parts. And that thing there is the soft jack that has some weights. It's got planetary gears and then some weights that fly out and push against the sides. We can have a look inside it. Just move the E-clip, and then the top should come off. There you go. Little weighted thing in there to make the eject soft, and underneath that planetary gears, so it gears up so that spins fast. Quite an interesting little thing there to make soft eject. Very good. There's the connector panel. Folds out nicely for servicing, but unfortunately it's a bit beyond being able to be serviced. It's just a bit old and tired. Interesting, they used flex in a couple of places, but for this front panel board they've just wired it. And there's only connectors on one end, the other end has little crimped on posts that have been soldered in, probably by hand. Well, not soldered by hand, but they'd have to be placed by hand. Interesting thing from the past. Yeah, it's the RF modulator that has an RF output. NV100 weighs only 3.1 kilograms without battery. And infrared remote control when you use the tuner. You connect into there a tuner to make, which also has the clock and timer on it, so it will make this able to function like a standard home VCR. Oh, and there's wired remote for when you're using it standalone. They're also controlled by the camera through the camera connection. Let's take a look inside it. I'm not going to open that one because I have one that's already been taken apart. So this has a newer VHS mechanism in it, a bit more compact, more direct drive for the capstan with brushless motor, and undo some clips. So now almost everything's on one board, and one front board for the controls and some CPU type thingies. Again, this one's also suffering leaking capacitors, so it's a little bit beyond repair, unfortunately. There's corrosion in various places. Still using the same old style through-hole, not plated, but through-hole connections that are weak, prone to being damaged, and not able to carry high current. Here's the RF modulator. It fits in that gap. Quite a neat design there. Opens up for servicing. On the bottom, you can see the loading mode is now here, and it's all driven through gears, so there's no belts to slip there, which is a nice design. The brushless motor for the capstan, and that has on the top there a toothed belt going over to the idler for the reels, which is quite good. Less slipping, although not completely good, because there's still a little tire thing there that rubs on the shaft of the capstan. Let's remove the loading mechanism so we can take a look under it. Now, what do we have to do? It's been a while since I took these ones apart. There's some front screws. This one doesn't have the red screws to indicate what you remove for servicing, which is a bit unusual. Okay, some wires. Now, there are connectors on some of these things, but not on all of them. Let me just put that out of the way. That still looks like a very complicated mechanism, but you can see now that the capstan drives this little gear here, which is pushed against it, and then there's a toothed belt which comes down, and then there's a little idler tire that pushes on one or other of those to turn the reels. There's M loading mechanism, and the back tension of the band which goes around the feed spool. There's full erase head. That's an impedance roller. Audio and control head. Pinch roller there. Pushes against the capstan when it's in play mode. So I've upgraded to the infrared LED for the end sensors, but this is actually two LEDs back to back focused outwards. The more modern ones use a single LED which can shine out of both sides. Yeah, there's some super capacitors on there, 1.8 volt 1 farad capacitors. Must be for the memory of something. I'm not sure what this needs to remember other than the tape counter. Now, when I had these running, they had a problem that I at the time wasn't able to track down and haven't attempted since, that the input switching between camera and the composite input connector is done automatically. The camera takes priority, I think, or I'm not sure which one takes priority. One, when you connect the source, it will take over from the other, and that's done. It's switched by this relay, but there's some sort of circuit for detecting the presence of the video signal, and for some reason that goes bad, and you hear the relay chattering continuously or intermittently. And I tried replacing various parts and capacitors in that part of the circuit, but didn't have any success. But otherwise, these machines were pretty reliable, I found. Finally, let's look at the EW0022, a nice, slim, lightweight portable VCR. It's very similar in functions to the earlier ones, but it's just done in a more compact way. I have the mechanism, or the whole internals from one here. So it has this membrane type control panel. The buttons feel quite nice, and the front panel board which has various things on it. There's this, which is servo board, some sort of bodge there. The tracking controls, slow and normal. The video stuff's done on this back board. And there's a bottom board, which we're going to have to try and get off. I need to remember how to do that. I think it's just plugged into the other PCBs. The back board is coming off. This machine might still work, I'm not sure about that. I don't think we need to take that off. So it has really changed the way the mechanism works here, and it's been simplified a great deal. We need to unplug that backboard. To unplug all these wires. All of the wires. Unplug everything. Yeah, so it doesn't fold out while staying assembled like the other ones do. So it's a little bit more difficult to work on, but there's not very much to work on now. Now there are 0 belts, 0 tires and rubbing things. Got DC brushless capstan motor, and then we've got 2 DC brushless motors for the reels. So they don't have any tires or belts or things driving them, they're just directly driven by their own motors, which is a massive improvement in reducing the amount of parts and improving the reliability. So there isn't really much reason to come under here because there's nothing to go wrong. Now what we need to do is eject it, because the eject solenoid is on there. Can we do that from out here? I think there's a way. There we go. And let's take off the cassette loading mechanism. Now there's something over here that has to be undone. Another red screw. There we go. That's the loading mechanism out of the way. Now we can see the mechanical parts are very simple. No reel driving. So that's all done with this piece here that has its own motor. There's a planetary gear under this one, the take-up reel. So the motor spins faster than the take-up reel, and the feed one is directly driven. Then there's a little solenoid there for braking. Actually the eject mechanism, how does that work? It's this part here. I'm not sure what pushes that. Oh, it's this. It comes from this rod. Okay, so the solenoid is just the braking. It seems to be bi-stable. Take the brakes off. There's hall sensors there for those. And there's the single LED where it emits both sides for the end sensors. There's a little leaf switch there for detecting when the a tape's been put in, like that, so that it's closed, but then the tape would be detected by the end sensors. So there's no back tension band anymore around the supply reel, because that's often something that fails because a little bit of felt comes unglued and falls out, and then you end up with slack tape around the head and the audio will go away, but the because it's not pulled tight enough. The video usually works, but not always. It gets a bit weird because the tape is too loose. But in this case, they just use this motor to provide a bit of torque in the reverse direction while it's unwinding, and it's controlled similarly with the little lever that the tape loops around, but that's now goes into an optical interrupter, so that's controlling the force that the motor is applying to the supply reel to control the tension. So it's done all electronically. There's a loading motor still, and there's a couple of things associated with that. There's the mode switch. That's what that is. Yeah, the mode switch, and this gear, and that transfers through an arm which does the tape threading. It also moves this lever here for the eject, and it moves this stuff through here for the pinch roller, but that's all it needs to do. It doesn't have any involvement with braking or other things on the reels. The head is new and improved design where the motor is all integrated. It has, instead of ball bearings, it uses specially shaped grooves on the shaft to force an oil around. Not exactly sure how that works, but it doesn't work now because the oil's dried up and the head will get a bit rattly, which is a problem with these machines, which otherwise have lasted really well. We now have the more modern type of plated through-hole boards. It's a really thin board to keep down the size of the machine. This mechanical system in the NV180 was used in a number of other machines. Here the AG6400, which is more or less the same but adds hi-fi audio and stereo sound. A little bit more professional using this XLR connector for the power input. But inside there the mechanism is pretty much the same thing. It's just got the different head for the hi-fi sound, and the circuits are different. There's a different bottom board with all the extra stuff on it for the hi-fi sound, so that shares a lot of the mechanical parts. And then based on the design of the NV180, there are a number of other machines that also have hi-fi sound and are sold under different brands. There's a Magnavox one, and there are a whole bunch of other brands which we'll take a look at in a separate video. So they take the same thing and then add hi-fi audio onto it. There are also variants that have just normal stereo audio rather than this one, which is mono only. We'll also take a look at camcorders in another video and take a look at the mechanism that they use with the small size video head and cameras with tubes before CCDs came along. Lots of really good stuff. I've put it all back together. Let's try it out. I've got a monitor there. I've got to this power supply which takes the shape of a battery. Connect that onto the battery terminals. It's no good. I'll just power cycle it now. It seems to be happy. Maybe it's on its last legs. So it's making a strange noise because the head is running rough because the oil in there is dried out. It's possible to stabilize it with your finger, but you can see it shakes the picture around because it's not running stable. The mechanism is very quick to operate because there's no parts that need to move around when the tape's changing direction. Slow motion. Yeah, but the head's not very happy. I think it's getting worse. We'll have a look at adjusting the tape tension. If we pull that lever in, then the tape goes slack and the picture disappears. And the monitor didn't like that very much. Very good. A really neat design VCR, and still works today. Perhaps they use better quality capacitors in this, or it's not quite at the age where they all start leaking. Alright,